Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to tackle the integumentary system. So we're going to be talking about the largest organ that we have in our body, which is our skin. So first we're going to start out by going over the integumentary system, what it consists of, and then we're going to go a little bit deeper into one of the important layers of our skin, which is the epidermis. So let's get into it. So our skin consists of three main layers, which are the epidermis, the dermis, and the hypodermis. And these layers are typically listed in order from which is most superficial, or the outermost layer, to the deepest or innermost layer. And our skin has a very important protective role when it comes to maintaining homeostasis. So the first thing it does is that it helps you regulate heat and moisture, and you may be familiar with this with the process of sweating. Another thing that happens in our skin that's really important is the production of vitamin D, and this happens when we receive exposure from sunlight. So vitamin D actually plays an important role in our skin by basically helping to maintain cell growth and metabolism. And lastly, the skin acts as a physical barrier as it's able to keep pathogens out. Now in this video we're going to talk mostly about the epidermis, and we'll go over the other layers of the integumentary system in later videos. But the epidermis is going to be the most superficial or outermost layer of our skin. The prefix epi means above, so the epidermis is literally the layer above the dermis. And the epidermis is going to be avascular, meaning that there aren't going to be any blood vessels present there. So what has to happen is that it gets nutrients from the lower level, the dermis, and nutrients and gas from the dermis will diffuse upwards into the epidermis and provide it with nourishment and oxygen that way. The cells in the epidermal layer tend to be a flattened type of shape, and this is because they are made up of a cell type called stratified squamous cells. Stratified just means that they're layered, so they're like little flat pancakes stacked on top of each other at the very outermost level of our skin. Now, the epidermis is actually made up of multiple layers, 5 to be exact. The cell type that primarily makes up the epidermis are cells called keratinocytes. And what happens is that they originate at the very bottom layer of the epidermis, which we'll definitely talk about later. And as they grow and divide at this level here, what happens is that the cells get pushed upwards. And as they get pushed upwards, they essentially start to change and differentiate into more specific cell types. And what comes along with this is usually an increase in the amount of keratin that they have within their cells. Aside from the keratinocytes that make up a large proportion of the epidermis actually contains other cell types as well, such as melanocytes, Langerhans cells, and Merkel cells, which we'll go over later on in the video. But for now, let's start with the most superficial layer of the epidermis. This is going to be the stratum corneum. And this name comes from the fact that the very outermost layer of the epidermis consists of a cell type called corneocytes. Now, before I mentioned that as the cells start at the very bottom layer of the epidermis, they start to divide and essentially grow and push each other upwards. And as this is happening, they're differentiating or becoming different. Corneocytes are going to be fully differentiated keratinocytes that have died. That's going to be the very outermost level of your skin that you can scratch and kind of maybe even see some sort of flaking off. That's the part of the skin that is essentially dead and is in the process of renewing itself by shedding. And the stratum corneum is important even though it's an outer level of dead cells because it helps to protect the body from infection as well as physical harm. So if you were to get a minor scratch that wasn't deep enough to go past the stratum corneum, you would essentially be fine because you wouldn't have technically broken into any skin that's alive. Okay, now the layer below the stratum corneum is going to be the stratum lucidum. And this layer is still going to be made up of dead keratinocytes, but they're dead cells that haven't fully matured into corneocytes yet. So they're not quite the cells that belong in the stratum corneum, and they're also not quite the cells that belong in the layer below the lucidum. But the important thing about the stratum lucidum is that it is only a layer that is present within the hands and the feet. So you may notice the skin on the palm of your hand, as well as the soles of your feet, are a little bit thicker and different in quality than the rest of your skin, right? But that's just because it has this extra layer that other parts of your body do not. So definitely be mindful if you see a question involving this layer of the skin on your test. They may ask you the layers of skin that are present in your palm, and you'll have to remember that there are going to be 5 in total. But if they were to specify that they were looking for the layers of skin that are located in your arm, you would not include the stratum lucidum. Okay, so below the stratum lucidum in some cases, and certainly below the stratum corneum, we're going to have the stratum granulosum. And this layer is going to be easy to pick out because the stratum granulosum is going to contain these little granules. So you'll actually see these little grains of lamellar bodies. And this is a really important layer of your skin because those lamellar bodies help to create the water barrier that your skin has. So That's what allows your skin to retain moisture so that water doesn't leave your skin too quickly, because again, you need water to nourish the cells that live there. And the way that these lamellar granules make up the water barrier is that they essentially form a hydrophobic membrane. So you literally have lipid particles that are embedded within your skin cells in this layer, and those lipid particles will make it so that water doesn't necessarily want to cross that outer barrier. So the water that you ingest as a part of your diet is prevented from just evaporating out of the skin by this membrane. So below the stratum granulosum, the deeper layer that we have is going to be the stratum spinosum. And the stratum spinosum is characterized by a lot of cell adhesion junctions called desmosomes. And desmosomes are a type of cell adhesion complex that helps to anchor cells together by parts of their cytoskeleton called the intermediate filaments. And this is actually a pretty strong connection that cells can have between each other. If we see in the picture here, these are all desmosomes, and we can see that these fibers, these filaments, are those intermediate filaments that are holding these cells together. And desmosomes are typically seen in tissues that experience a lot of mechanical stress. So for example, heart muscles have a lot of desmosomes, as well as uterine tissue. And this makes sense to see that we have a whole bunch of desmosomes in our skin, right? Our skin has to be one of the most flexible organs we have because it has to mold over the shape of our organs, it has to twist and bend and stretch just as we move. So in the stratum spinosum, we're going to see a lot of desmosome content, which is really what helps facilitate the flexibility of our skin. And it's kind of cool because the stratum spinosum kind of has this spiny appearance because of all these desmosomes. So because the cells are being held together by these desmosomes, they're being stretched at each point of junction, and that's why we see that they have a spiny appearance. And the stratum spinosum also has the highest proportion of Langerhans cells. These cells are particularly important in communicating between the adaptive and innate immune systems. The skin is often the first line of defense that we have against pathogens, so anything that would manage to break through the other barriers of the skin, that information would need to be communicated to the immune system. And finally, the last and deepest layer of the epidermis is going to be the stratum basale. It's also known as the stratum germinativum, and this is because the word germinate means that you're bringing something into existence, and this is the layer that I talked about before, where the keratinocytes are actually being born and are maturing from. And this is possible at the basal layer because the basal layer contains stem cells for those keratinocytes. So those stem cells can become the cells that will migrate and divide upwards throughout the other layers of the epidermis. And aside from the keratinocytes that we can actually see here in this micrograph, which I thought was pretty cool, we can also see other cell types as well. So the stratum basale is also where we find the Merkel cells and the melanocytes. Now the melanocytes again are going to produce that pigment called melanin, and that is what helps to provide skin color in human beings as well as provide protection from UV radiation from the sun. The cells that make up melanin are called melanocytes, and then the melanin is going to be transported into the keratinocytes at other layers. And Merkel cells are actually pretty cool because these cells are part of the somatosensory system. These are going to be receptors that are responsible for receiving information on touch. And the technical term for this type of receptor is called a mechanoreceptor, right? Because it's receiving mechanical or touch input. And Merkel cells specifically are attuned for light touch sensations. There are other cell types that are attuned for hard presses or even vibrations. And it's cool because these are the cells that are most abundant in our fingertips. So this is why our fingertips are so sensitive, especially when you consider that early in life, the way that babies and children navigate their environment is by A, putting things in their mouth, and B, by touching them with their hands. And this is because the lips and the hands have the most representation in the brain because they have some of the most highly attuned sensory receptors. And the way that these receptors carry information to the brain is that they synapse with or join with somatosensory neurons. And we can see here that this is going to be this yellow structure here. And these neurons is what carries the information from the periphery, or the outside, to the central nervous system, which is the brain. Okay, so we've talked about a lot of confusing, fancy Latin words in this video, but here's a great mnemonic that'll help you remember all of the layers of the epidermis. And that's going to be, come let's get some beers. And this mnemonic will help you to remember the layers from most superficial, or outermost, to the most deep, or innermost. So first is the stratum corneum, which is made up of those dead keratinocytes. Then we have the lucidum, which is only present in our palms and soles of our feet. After that, we have the granulosum that contains those granules that help with our skin's water barrier. Next, we have the spinosum, which has a spiny appearance due to all of the desmosomes there. And lastly, we have the basal layer, and that's going to be the beer in our mnemonics. So all you have to do is remember this, as well as that one little exception, and you'll be golden. Okay, so let's just distill some of the key information that we have to take away from this video. First, we should remember that the integumentary system is going to consist of the skin and its layers. So the outermost layer that we talked about in this video is going to be the epidermis, and then we also have the dermis and the hypodermis, which we'll cover in later videos. The epidermis is mostly comprised of these keratinocytes that we talked about, and as they start at the basement or basal layer of the epidermis, they divide and migrate up until they become dead cells at the very top of the stratum corneum. And lastly, we have our mnemonic, which is "Come, let's get some beers." This is going to help us remember all 5 layers of the epidermis, as well as the exception of the stratum lucidum, which again is only present in our hands and feet. Hey everyone, welcome back. In this next video, we're going to talk about the second layer of the integumentary system, and that's going to be the dermis. We'll specifically talk about the 2 layers of the dermis, which include the papillary dermis and the reticular dermis, along with some of the things that are found in the dermis, like hair follicles. So with that said, let's get into it. So the dermis is going to be located one skin layer below the epidermis, and it's going to have a few interesting characteristics as well. So in this picture, we can see here that this is what constitutes the epidermis, and thus everything below it in this region is going to be the dermis. And we can see that there are things like hair follicles that reside there, as well as sweat glands, and even oil glands that secrete oil onto the hair. So the dermis is where we're going to find a lot of the vasculature, we're going to find a lot of actual living tissue, as opposed to the epidermis where the very top layer is going to be dead. And what is characteristic of the dermis is the fact that there is this dense, irregular tissue that resides there. And in this case, irregular means that the tissue that's there is kind of interwoven and interlocked together, as opposed to the epidermis, right, where we saw a lot of those flattened cells just stacked one layer on top of the other in a parallel fashion. The irregular tissue is going to be interwoven and interlocked in like a dense kind of manner. And this is going to be because the primary type of skin cell that we're going to have in the dermis is going to be a fibroblast. And fibroblasts tend to produce a lot of collagen fibers. And this is what leads to the dermis being very strong, but also able to have elastic qualities as well. And as we mentioned before, the dermis is home to glands and vasculature, basically usually the functional elements of skin. And just as a fun fact, the dermis is actually the layer that tattoo ink is injected into. And it's part of the reason why tattoo ink lasts so long in the skin. The epidermis is not so much a good candidate for tattoo ink because it basically turns itself over about every 28 days or so. So remember, the cells that are in the basement membrane of the epidermis are constantly dividing and migrating upwards until they differentiate and die at the very surface. The dermis doesn't do any of that. The dermis isn't replaced every month or so, but what happens is that tattoo ink that's injected deep into the dermis gets eaten up by immune cells called macrophages. So what happens is that they kind of just eat an ink particle and they sit there until they die. And then once that macrophage dies, another macrophage comes along and basically does the same thing. So the tattoo ink kind of just gets passed between macrophages as if it were like a relay race. Okay, so let's talk about the very top layer of the dermis. Well, the top layer of the dermis is going to be called the papillary dermis, and this is because it has papillae. Now, you might be familiar with this term if you've heard of papillae on your tongue. Those are your taste buds. But papillae are basically just any type of upwards round projection. And we can see that there's this squiggly line at the interface between the dermis below and the epidermis above. And this is actually incredibly important. The dermis is the layer that has all the blood vessels, and thus it gets its nutrients directly. However, the epidermis does not, and we can see that here. There are no real blood vessels that permeate upwards into the epidermis. So it relies on the lower level, the dermis, to get its oxygen and its nutrients through diffusion. And this boundary is where that happens. And the shape of the dermal papillae is actually really important for this very function, because the rounded projections actually increase the surface area between the epidermis and the dermis. So just to visualize that quickly, if we have 2 surfaces, we can see that there are more opportunities. If we consider this to be events of diffusion, we can see that there are more opportunities for diffusion to occur just by changing the shape and making more space available for that. Additionally, the papillae also help to keep both layers joined together. So imagine if we had a boundary here and it was just flat once again, then we can see that it would be pretty easy to pull it apart. However, when we have this interlocking shape, then we can see that they kind of fit together a little bit more strongly like a puzzle, and those two layers can interface strongly, have increased chance of diffusion, not just because of the surface area, but also because of the proximity as well. And another cool fact is that the rippling of the papillary dermis is actually responsible for our fingerprints. This is part of the reason why our fingerprints are so unique, is because it just happens to be a result of how your skin layers are literally like rubbing up against each other. And if we think of the skin on our finger as being extremely thin, then it makes sense that we would actually see these ridges translating to the bumps that we see on our fingerprints. Okay, so deeper to the papillary dermis, we have the reticular dermis. And this is going to be this area, the majority of it in the middle, primarily where we see all of the glands and blood vessels. And this is going to be the area of the dermis where we see a lot of those fibers that we talked about earlier. And these are going to consist of reticular fibers, collagen, and elastin, which are produced by those fibroblasts and other associated skin cells. And the collagen and elastin are going to make the dermis very resistant to tension, so it's going to be stretchy, but it's also going to be strong. And again, this is where we're going to see a lot of the functional aspects of skin, such as receptors for touch or temperature. We can also have hair follicles. This is where nail beds actually grow from. And also we have the glands like sweat glands and oil glands, like the ones that we have in our face. And lastly, we'll just finish up by talking a little bit about hair follicles. Hair actually has a very important protective role when it comes to mammals and other animals. So what hair follicles do is that they actually generate the hair itself, and hair is simply just long strands of keratin protein. So when we say that something is a filament, that just means that it is in a long, thin form. Basically what the hair follicle does is it not only grows the hair, but it helps to anchor it there. And what hair does is that it not only provides a means of regulating temperature by insulating us, but it also protects us from the sun. For example, since we have so much hair on our heads, that's thought to be because we are protecting our scalps from UV damage from the sun. Also physical protection as well, because having hair in the way of the skull, which is incredibly important, would certainly be better than just having no hair at all, where if you get hit in the head, that's just kind of like a direct blow, as opposed to hair that can potentially soften it. Okay, so this video was pretty short and sweet, but let's just talk over the key points that we should remember. We introduced the dermis, which is the layer of skin that lies below the epidermis, and we learned that the dermis has two parts: the papillary dermis that has those papillary projections, as well as the reticular dermis, which consists mostly of that dense irregular tissue. A lot of the functional elements of skin, like sweat glands and hair, reside within the reticular dermis. And lastly, we learned a little bit about hair, which evolutionarily has had a protective role in mammals. Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to wrap up the integumentary chapter by talking about two important things. First, we're going to go over the exocrine glands that are located in the dermis, and then we'll finish it out by talking about the hypodermis, which is the deepest layer of our skin. So let's get into it. So the thing about exocrine glands is that they actually end up releasing their products to an external surface. Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to wrap up the integumentary chapter by talking about two important things. First, we're going to go over the exocrine glands that are located in the dermis, and then we'll finish it out by talking about the hypodermis, which is the deepest layer of our skin. So let's get into it. So the thing about exocrine glands is that they actually end up releasing their products to an external surface via a duct. So this is going to be in contrast with the endocrine system, in which we have glands that release their hormones, but they do so directly into the blood. Now, a great example of an exocrine gland is going to be the tear gland. So the tear gland is going to release tears onto the surface of our eyes to lubricate it, and it does so via the tear ducts. Later on in this video, we'll also talk about more exocrine glands that are specific to the integumentary chapter, but they all have one thing in common, is that they utilize ducts to get their products to where they need to go. And these exocrine glands are going to be located in the dermis, particularly within the reticular dermis, which is that lower level of the dermis that has most of that dense, irregular connective tissue that will hold those glands in place. And we actually have a few types of exocrine glands that we're going to talk about in this chapter, and that's going to be sudoriferous exocrine glands, which are also known as the sweat glands, as well as sebaceous glands, which are typically the oily glands that we see in our face. So let's go ahead and talk about the sweat glands that we have, as well as their variations. So the first type of sweat gland that we're going to talk about are the eccrine sweat glands. And this is going to be the classic example that you may think of when you hear the term sweat gland. Eccrine sweat glands are responsible for most of our body's perspiration. So these are going to be the glands that are located all throughout our body's surface, and those are the ones that produce the sweat that we see on our skin after a period of heavy exercise or exertion. And the purpose of these sweat glands is that they actually help with thermoregulation, or just regulating our body's temperature. It's not too good for us to get either too cold or too hot. And the way that our body manages our temperature when we get too hot is that it takes advantage of a process called evaporative cooling. So our body's going to release a lot of sweat while we're physically active and exerting ourselves. Now, evaporation means that a liquid is going from the liquid state to the gas state. And any sort of change in state is going to require a change in energy. And so in this case, when we secrete sweat onto our skin, the heat that we produce by becoming active is actually the heat that causes the liquid to evaporate. And because water is so good at holding onto heat, that heat gets stored in the water, which then just evaporates into the air and is effectively just taken away from our bodies like that. So that's how evaporative cooling and sweat actually really helps us thermoregulate. If you've also noticed that one of the first places that you may sweat from is your armpits, that's because there are a lot of eccrine sweat glands located there. Funnily enough, there are also a lot of eccrine glands located on our palms of our hands and the soles of our feet. But evolutionarily, it's thought that it helps to increase the friction that we may feel between the ground and our feet. Keep in mind that this is probably taking into consideration that people who evolved early didn't really have shoes. This is also kind of supported by the fact that lots of animals like dogs and cats also have these eccrine sweat glands on the pads of their feet. So, just a thought. Okay, and now the next type of sweat gland we have are apocrine glands. And the difference between an apocrine and eccrine gland is that eccrine glands produce sweat, which is mostly water, whereas apocrine glands are going to produce more of a viscous or oily secretion. And this is because apocrine glands release directly into hair follicles. So in this diagram here, let's just ignore the fact that it says sebaceous gland here. I want to focus on the fact that this follicle shaft is what we're talking about. And that's the same follicle shaft that apocrine glands secrete into. We'll talk about sebaceous glands more in the next slide, but do get comfortable with the idea that both sebaceous glands and sudoriferous apocrine glands are going to be secreting their products into the hair follicle. Now, the function of apocrine glands can really differ because it really depends on where the gland is. And because they differ based on their location, apocrine glands can also specialize and become very highly attuned to one specific function. For example, a ceruminous gland is a gland that produces earwax, or scientifically cerumen. And we may not think of this immediately as a type of sweat gland, but it is. It's a type of modified apocrine gland that secretes earwax instead of some other oily secretion of proteins and fats. Same thing with the mammary glands. The mammary glands are going to be producing milk in someone that is lactating. And although milk is a leap from earwax, and earwax is a leap from just a simple oil, apocrine glands are also classified by how often they release their products. So, for example, eccrine glands are going to be releasing sweat almost nonstop once they're active, but apocrine glands tend to work in bursts. So it also does matter the mechanism of action, even though apocrine glands can specialize and seemingly appear to be much different. But indeed, they are the same class of glands. Okay, so moving on from sudoriferous glands, we're going to talk about sebaceous glands. You may be familiar with this type of gland if you are really into skincare or you have really oily skin, but these are the glands that are really abundant on our face, and they produce a substance called sebum, which is basically just like a waxy type of product or oil that helps to waterproof our skin. And just like eccrine glands, sebaceous glands are going to be located all over the body, although they will be a little bit more dense in certain areas like the face, and they are not present actually on the soles of our feet or on the palms of our hands. Basically, sebaceous glands are kind of going to act like the apocrine glands that we talked about, just in the sense that they're going to release their products into that hair follicle here. Let's remember that the difference between the apocrine and the sebaceous gland is that they're producing different things. Now, if you've ever experienced a breakout, these guys are usually the culprits. So we know that the sebaceous glands are going to be releasing their products into the hair follicle. Now, if, for example, the hair follicle itself were to become plugged, and thus nothing could be released from it, what happens is that you get a lot of sebum and keratin trapped in that follicle. And the sebaceous glands are going to keep producing sebum because they can't really tell when this is happening. And what happens is that you get a buildup of this fluid and this oil inside of your pores. And this ends up feeding the bacteria that live on our skin. And so this bacteria ends up becoming trapped in this little space as well. So once that happens, we start to get inflammation, and that's when you get acne, and your face kind of swells up around that little point, and sometimes you'll see a whitehead, or sometimes you won't if it's really deep below. Okay, so moving on from the dermis and its glands, we're going to talk briefly about the hypodermis. This is going to be the deepest layer of our skin, and it's going to be located below the dermis. So we'll have the epidermis on top, the dermis in the middle, and the hypodermis at the very bottom. It's for this reason that the hypodermis is also called subcutaneous tissue. And the hypodermis is this region where we have a lot of this fat tissue, as well as some of the larger blood vessels and nerves that haven't necessarily snaked their way up to the dermis. And unlike the dermis that lies above it, the hypodermis is not going to have that dense connective web of tissue, but instead it's going to have loose tissue fibers and a lot of fat. And that's because fat storage is actually one of the main functions of the subcutaneous tissue. Again, fat is a great insulator, so having the fat in the deepest layer of our skin really does help to keep the heat inside. This video was short but sweet, but let's just talk about some of the key takeaways here. So in this video, we covered the deepest level of the integumentary system, which is the hypodermis. Also, we talked about some exocrine glands that are located within the dermis, which is the layer above the hypodermis. And we mostly talked about sweat glands or sudoriferous glands, and we know that they are distinguished into two types, which are eccrine and apocrine. Eccrine glands are the main sweat glands, and apocrine glands tend to specialize. And additionally, we talked about sebaceous glands, which help to produce sebum, and that's going to help with waterproofing our hair and the skin surrounding that area.